I recognized it immediately. The house. Our house. I didn't remember living there. Remembered almost nothing about this town. Why should I? We moved away when I was 4 years old. Barely more than a toddler. But I recognized the house. I painted it in the 9th grade, using an old photo pulled from the memories box in my mother's closet. I won an award for it in our school's art contest. That being my first award. I had painted the frame and still have it hung up in my studio space. It was an old Tudor house, a design I always privately enjoyed, though it was long out of fashion. 2 stories, with a steeply gabled roof, as is typical of the style. The first floor's exterior was composed of decorative stone. The second floor was white masonry, with crisscrossed half timbers, also typical of the style. I'm the sort of person who is highly susceptible to pareidolia and always think of the front of the house as its face. This one had a very friendly, welcoming face. If I had to characterize it, the house looked like a smiling, stout, bearded man. The sort of man who would give you a hug upon meeting you and thrust a frosty mug of ale in your hands. That's what I thought. I smiled up at the house and glanced into the messy passenger seat. Camera, scrapbook, loose pages, charcoal stick, and a grimy smudge staining the upholstery. I had already stopped a few times to sketch before meeting with my agent to hash out the finer details of the gig that brought me out here to the countryside. I glanced at my watch. 12:36. I still had time. It was a teleconference anyway. I can do that in the car if I needed to. I stepped out into the warm air of early autumn with my camera around my neck, ready to take pictures if I felt compelled to do so. The first thing I did was walk up to the front door and see if anyone was home. In my experience, people tend to get a little edgy when you stomp around their private property uninvited and take pictures or sit down for a charcoal sketch. The front walk was made of the same sort of flagstone as the first floor of the house. The entryway had an archway that I'm sure real estate agents would refer to as charming. The front door was made of a dark wood with leaded windows arranged in a diamond pattern. Also charming. I knocked 3 times and waited. And waited. No answer. I shrugged and turned back to the car. That's when I noticed the sign in the yard. The house was up for rent by a group called Horndyke Realty. Awful name. On impulse, I pulled out my phone and dialed the number on the sign. This time I didn't have to wait. On the first ring, a woman picked up and said, "Horndyke Realty. This is Susan Lakewood. How can I help you find your dream home, a reality?" In a sunny and well-rehearsed manner. "Hi, Susan," I answered. "My name is John Benson. I'm calling in regards to the house for rent at 737 Bluebird Avenue. I was wondering if I might arrange a tour of the home at some point." "I'm sure that can be arranged. Give me 1 second, hon." I could hear keys clattering on the other end while I waited and wondered just what I was doing. I only planned on staying throughout the fall, and I didn't expect anyone to rent me a home on a 3-month lease. Additionally, It was far more room than I could possibly need. Susan came back on the line and said, "All right, Mr. Benson. If it works for you, I can meet you there later this afternoon. How does 3:30 sound?" I told her it sounded just fine. I left my information with her and told her I would see her then. I stared back up at the house for a few moments, and it stared back at me with its friendly bearded face. I turned back to the car. Across the street, a bald man in a tank top was mowing his lawn. He waved at me in a mildly suspicious sort of way, and, well, I waved back. His house was also a two-door. My agent/manager, Lisa Kadinsky, claimed a distant relative to Wassily Kadinsky, the famed Russian abstract painter. She did not claim an iota of his talent, but perhaps because of his familial connection, she had a great love of the arts. She also had a great love of making money from art. And so, with no small amount of cajole, convinced me to take on this job. Like most pretentious artsy types, I thought commercial art was so far beneath me as to be invisible to the naked eye. She was persistent, and eventually I relented, though not without much grumbling. I teleconferenced with her in the back of a local diner, which had the mystifying name of the Scalded Dog Grill. Most of the patrons sat at the counter, and though many of them gave me the sort of dubious looks all small-town types give to out-of-towners, they left me alone to my Skype and patty melt. Lisa's face appeared on my smartphone screen. A short, smart hairstyle in blazing silver, high cheekbones, elaborate makeup, small, pursed lips. As always, she sounded very happy to see me. She always asked me dozens of questions, rapid fire. I learned she only wanted the answer to the final query. The rest was just small talk, and she had no time for mutual small talk. "Johnny! How's my boy? How's the countryside? Are the locals treating you well? Blink SOS if they're planning to sacrifice you to their corn god. Is the water drinkable? Do they say y'all out there? Did you receive my email with the packet detailing the wishes of our generous benefactor?" "Yes," I told her, and I looked it over. 12 paintings. At least half of them including rustic structures, all watercolor, all bursting with autumn foliage. It should make for a remarkable tribute and artistically vivacious calendar. "Don't be snotty, Johnny. It doesn't become you," she scolded. "They are paying an obscene amount of money for your calendar art, and that's to say nothing of paying all your expenses while you're out gallivanting in the sticks. Speaking of which, have you made living arrangements yet? Don't be stingy. Find a nice place you can work in. No reason to stay at the Bates Motel on their dime." I looked at a few places, which was only half a lie. The only place I actually looked at was the house. "I'm meeting with the realtor later about this place." "Splendid!" she exclaimed. We went on to discuss other tedious details of the project while I ate my patty melt. It was pretty good, actually, and probably not made of scalded dog. After a time, she was satisfied that I knew what I was doing and was not going to waste away my advance on a mad artist's opium binge. I was then released out into the world to kill time until 3:30, where I would meet with the realtor Susan met me outside of the house and reintroduced herself. She looked more or less what I expected her to look like. She was a middle-aged, pear-shaped, and had a cloud of graying hair. She wore a pink pantsuit that may have been fashionable in the day of shoulder pads and pantsuits. After educating me all about the exterior features, generally raving about the location and neighborhood, the schools, and the manner of attitude about which I cared little, she finally let me into the house. The inside of the house was in pristine shape. Although in the same way I couldn't quite pinpoint it, it did not seem to have been occupied recently. It didn't smell musty, it smelled like cinnamon roll scented candles. The source of this feeling of desertion was more subtle. It did not seem unwelcoming, however. More the opposite. From the moment I stepped inside, I knew I wanted to stay there and be damned to any notion of practicalities. The second floor had a sunroom with a hardwood floor, and I knew it would be perfect for painting. While I half listened to Susan's pitch, just enough to answer her stream of questions, I subconsciously sought out some feeling of familiarity, though there was none to be had. Of course there wasn't. Who could remember anything from when they were that young? Well, some people could perhaps, but I couldn't. The earliest memory I had was in the house in which I spent the rest of my childhood. I was sitting at our kitchen table trying to read a newspaper, though with limited success, and I did not know how to read more than a few words at the time. After a time, we had already seen all the rooms and Susan was reaching to the end of her pitch. She received a phone call. Apologetically, she told me she had to take it, and that I should explore on my own for a few moments. I took her advice. The house had 3 bedrooms, 2 on the top floor and 1 on the bottom. I sat in all of them, spending the most time in the bottom 2, one of which had to have been my old room. I felt nothing from any of them. Finally, I returned to the living room and sat on the hearth to wait for Susan's return. It was there that I had the memory. It was a little more than a flash, but clear as day. I held in my hand a drawing, which I presented to somebody. It was a teenage girl whose features I recognized in my own reflection. She had to have been a relative. I said to her, "Look, Maddie," and she smiled, taking the drawing from me, and that was it. Maybe a 2-second memory of someone I knew then, but I have no recollection of now. I was stumped. I knew all of my cousins, and all the girls were my age or younger. None of them were named Maddie, or anything similar. She didn't even look like a cousin. She looked like she could have been my sister, if I had a sister, but I'm an only child. Shortly thereafter, Susan returned. I explained to her my situation, and that I was very interested in renting this house, but only for a short-term lease. Money, however, was no object. To my great surprise, she beamed at me. It seemed a family intended to move in after the first of the year, and the call was them, arranging to make a deposit. As long as I was cleared out by then, she would be happy to rent to me. Deposit plus first and last month's rent, which were all paid in advance, of course. Lisa handed me the fine details of the rental agreement, including all the check and document signing. I'm perfectly capable of doing such things myself, but Lisa insisted. Always eager to earn her cut in any way she could find. I usually accommodated her desires, as it freed up a lot of time to artistic pursuits, such as goofing off and watching Motel Cable. I had to wait until the next day to move into the house. A true multitasker. I sketched and drank beer as I watched television. Though I was able to truly focus on none of these tasks. My mind kept drifting to that transient memory from the fireplace. Who was Maddie? Where did Maddie go? What was Maddie short for? Madison Madeline? Could have been Maggie, considering how young I was, so maybe Margaret? I glanced down at my drawing. Not work-related. I sometimes dabbled in figure drawing and subsequential art. Blame it on a childhood love of superheroes. I flipped the sheet over and started a new sketch. One of Maddie. I could still recall her face somehow. It seemed that, having regained the memory, my recall of it was surprisingly vivid. Her chin was sharp, like mine, but her cheekbones were rounder. Her eyes were almond-shaped, like mine, but darker and glinting like coins at the bottom of a deep well. Her hair was a sandy blonde, much lighter than mine, shoulder-length and wildly teased. That makes sense. It would have been the early 90s. People still wore their hair pretty big back then. Her smile was an enigma, one that tested my eraser. It was so warm but cold. Loving but not cruel exactly. That's not the right word, but much like rendering it in pencil, describing her smile in words proved elusive. Elusive. Perhaps that's it. Reasonably satisfied, I set my pencil aside and viewed my sketch in full. I frowned. If the drawing was accurate, she nearly had to be a close relative. The family resemblance was uncanny. I was almost convinced I had been filling in blanks in my memory and made a sketch of myself as a teenage girl. Almost. If I didn't snag on that smile, I would have been convinced this whole thing was just a fantasy, some sort of wishful thinking. That smile, though, it meant something. I sipped at my beer, still staring at the sketch, wondering what it meant. I had no answers, and so I threw the sketch aside. I spent the rest of the night, what little remained of it anyway, sipping at my beer and vegging out to sitcoms. It had been a long day, and soon I can feel my eyelids grow heavy and my chin sink into my chest. I left my fourth beer half empty on the nightstand and switched off the television, and then bedside lamp. I set an alarm on my phone to ensure that I was up and about, ready to pick up the keys from Susan. At Horndike Realty. Awful name. I was asleep in moments. That night I had a dream. I dreamt of Maddie. She led me by the hand through the fields of gold, swaying in the warm sun. The sun blazed in the sky an impossibly vibrant blue. She kept looking back at me, smiling, laughing. I laughed too. "Come on," she urged, not impatiently, but with joyous imperative of someone who has something wonderful to show. "We're almost there." I glanced down at my feet. Still small and not totally sure of myself. Not at these speeds. If I fell, I would stain my pants. They were corduroys, and went swish, swish, swish with every stride. The shoes were bright red sneakers, with bright white soles. They had lightning bolts on the side, and that made me run faster. Or so I believed. Almost there! She cried and seemed to restrain herself from running faster. If she did, she would have to drag me the rest of the way. Wait until you see it. Finally, we burst through the golden fields and Maddie helped me through an old and crusty wooden fence, taking special care to guide me away from snagging a nail and other dangers. Beyond the fence was a strip of old trees and shadows. I started to get scared, but I didn't get too scared. Maddie was there. Maddie would look out for me. She smiled down at me and gave my hand another tug. It's right through here, she told me. I smiled to show her how brave I was. Not a baby at all. Birds were in the trees. Big ones. They looked down at us and they were big as houses. But Maddie wasn't scared. No. She was mad at the old birds for staring at us. Go on, get! She cried up at the birds, throwing a stick at one. It didn't hit it, but they got the message and flapped away. She laughed again, and I laughed too. Dumb birds, I said. That's right, she replied, and my heart soared. We skipped through the rest of the forest, which wasn't much of a forest at all, really. On the other side was a yard, all overgrown with grass as tall as I was, or taller even. I was afraid again. Of snakes this time. But still not too afraid because Maddie was there, and if she could scare away those birds, she could scare away the snakes too. There was a path, and she led me through it. The bugs made noise on and on. I was looking down at the grass, still kind of worried about the snakes, because they can bite me if Maddie wasn't fast enough. So I didn't see what we came to see until Maddie said, "There it is, kiddo." I looked up and my heart skipped a beat and fell 2 stories. It was the oldest building I ever saw, all rotted out and dark with one big door and one big window in the top, and it loomed down on me. It looked like the face of an angry monster, all mouth and hungry for little boys. It could swallow up my whole entire class in one gulp if it wanted to. Maddie chucked me on the shoulder, having seen me shaking like a leaf at the sight of it. Don't be scared, kiddo. It's just an old barn, that's all. But now that you know about it, it's our secret clubhouse. Now, come on. She tugged my hand and I started to follow her. What choice did I have? But no sooner did we reach the big-mouthed door, but a loud and warbling siren filled the air. It was a bad siren, a stay-away siren, a cell phone alarm, telling me it was time to wake up. Even after a shave, a hot shower, a cup of gas station coffee that was as hot as it was mediocre, and a surprisingly good gas station cruller, I could not shake that dream from my mind. Dream. It was a memory. I had no doubt about that, although I also had no evidence to back it up. I could remember nothing further than what was revealed in its contents, and could certainly not recall any crusty old barn clubhouse. As for the identity of Maddie, I could think of only one thing that could help shed light on this mystery. Unfortunately, it was calling my mom to ask her. Now, don't get me wrong, I love my mother. And like a good son, I call her twice a year whenever I need it or not. It was just that calling her meant having to hear a load of passive-aggressive judgment. See, even when my paintings started to sell and real money began to filter in, she still vocally disapproved of my career. or hobby, as she calls it. She was equally disapproving of my swinging bachelor lifestyle. Also, as she called it. It seemed she wanted a son who would marry a nice girl, move into the suburbs, get a job at an office, and sire half a dozen precious angel grandchildren for her to dote and impose her will upon. I was perfectly happy being single and also gay. She had yet to refer to my sexuality as a hobby, but I can sense her thinking it. Swallowing my dread, I pulled out my phone and pulled her number up in my contacts. She answered on the third ring, as per usual, sounding delighted to hear from me and deeply disappointed in my every decision. My sporadic contact with her in particular. Wading through a mere of conversation with her proved a grueling slog, but eventually I managed to steer the conversation to the matter at hand. I explained to her where I was and what I was doing there. She seemed baffled that anyone would want paintings of some dead trees in a nasty old barn, but was happy that I was keeping myself busy. The usual condescending crap. I tried to remind myself that she was a loving mother who only wanted what was best for her son. Enough small talk. I decided I was going to ask my question and get the hell off of the phone with her. So, I started trying to ease my way into what felt like essentially an odd question. Turns out that old house was up for rent. I'm going to stay there while I'm working here. Why would you need a house that big? My mom asked, trying to sound nonchalant but sounding brittle instead. Why? A place like that is too big for a swinging bachelor like you. Maybe, I allowed. But I don't know. I just like the place. My sponsors are footing the bill anyway, and it's got some great studio space upstairs. I guess, she sniffed. But it kind of seems like you're wasting those poor people's money. Mom, I groaned, dragging the free hand through my hair. I was starting to get a headache. They don't care about a couple of $1,000s of rent. It's chump change. All they care about is getting my paintings on time. And I can do that more reliably when I'm relaxed. Anyway, that's not what I'm calling you about. Well, what are you calling about? I have a life too, you know. And a job for that matter. Look, it's just... On the spot, I wasn't sure how I wanted to phrase this. The thing is, being back in that house brought back some memories. I doubt that, Mom said, more brittle than ever. You were just a baby when you lived there, barely out of diapers. Well, I remembered something. I remembered... Did I ever get babysat by a relative? Your grandmother a time or two, she said dismissively. Why? No, not grandma. Someone like a teenager, a cousin maybe? What, like Jeff? I wouldn't trust that little punk to watch my pet rock. Look, I need to get going. I cut her off. No, not Jeff. A girl. Maybe 14. Her name was Maddie, or maybe Maggie. Something like that. There was a pause on the end. Gathering her memories, maybe. Oh, I just remembered, she said finally. Maddie. You had an imaginary friend named Maddie for a while. You grew out of it, I guess. Yeah, listen, I gotta go. It was good talking with you, John. I love you. I love you too. But she already hung up. Maddie. An imaginary friend? Bull. But if she was lying, why would she lie about that? It figures. I go to my mom for answers and I wind up more confused than ever. I glanced down at my watch and saw that it was already time to meet up with Susan, so I abandoned my questions for another time. I gathered up the empty bottles and the remains of my dinner and threw them in the trash, gathered what little gear I brought with me to the motel, and hopped back into the car. After leaving the keys with the clerk, I set off to move into my new old accommodation, vowing to count that phone call as my Christmas call. By early afternoon, I was moving my meager possessions into the house, which thankfully was furnished. The back of my van was loaded with a massive roll of watercolor paper. I work large. Several shipping tubes, a plastic tub loaded with tubes of paint, a box of fresh new paints, mostly autumn colors, 2 suitcases of clothing, a box of paperbacks I hadn't had the time to read yet, a pile of sketchbooks, a motley assortment of brushes, a canvas bag stuffed with other assorted art supplies, and my laptop. I brought exactly no furniture or kitchen supplies. I would take inventory after lugging all of these supplies inside and plan a shopping expedition for later in the day. Utilities, including Wi-Fi, were already set up by Mrs. Kadinsky, and I made a mental note to thank her later. She thought of everything. I put some music on to make the place seem less empty and tomb-like, then began to set up shop. I had just about set up my studio space the way I liked it, and was admiring the way the sun shone in this particular part of the afternoon when the doorbell rang. Mildly perplexed to have a visitor so soon after arriving, I journeyed downstairs to answer. At the door was a uniformed gentleman, accompanied by a dolly loaded with boxes. Handsome, but a bit too young for me, and straight besides, I judged. Anyways, I was here to work, not break hearts. "John Benson?" he asked, and I nodded. "I'm with Marvin's Thriftway. I'm here to deliver your groceries." Kadinsky. She really did think of anything. She was a marvel. "Thanks," I said. "Come on in." I led him to the kitchen, and we made small talk for a while as he unloaded the groceries and filled the barren pantry and refrigerator. His name was Wayne and seemed desperately eager to leave for the big city and start a band. He was impressed by my status as a professional artist. He wanted to see my work, but I had nothing to show him. All I can do was give him my business card and the link to my Flickr account. I left him a generous tip, since it wasn't my money, to which he responded, "Thanks, fam," and departed. He left a joint on the counter, which I promptly threw into the wastebasket with a laugh. With the shopping portion of my afternoon covered, thanks to the marvelous Miss Kadinsky, I was free to scout for potential objects for my painting. Though I was more or less about landscapes and architectural paintings, I loved scouting for pleasing locations. I grabbed my knapsack, loaded it with all my gear, and dashed out the door. The leaves were beginning to change in earnest, and the sky was as vibrant as it appeared in my dream. Color and beauty were everywhere. I can scarcely narrow my search. The weather was warm and sunny, but with a crisp breeze. It was a perfect day to explore and spend hours, and took thousands of photos, sketched dozens of scenic vistas, and scouted numerous likely barns and old structures. I was having the time of my life, and I could remember thinking over and over again how lucky I was that someone would pay me to do this. Eventually, the day reached its end, and though the sunset was as gorgeous as any other part of this environment, I almost cursed it for being the end of a good time. I judged there to be just enough light left in the day to scout a final barn, the location of which was given up to me by a helpful resident. Word of my presence had spread quickly, it seemed, and most seemed happy to assist me in my efforts. By the time I had reached the building, the last of the light was fading out of the sky, and thus I could not take a proper reference photo. But that was all right. I would just have a look and head back for the house. As I looked up at the barn, as beautiful in its decay as any other I had seen that day, I began to feel strangely apprehensive. Though it wasn't the same as the barn in my dream, I'm certain of that. I felt the same fear and trepidation I experienced in that so recently recovered memory. The door was open a crack, revealing nothing of the dusty darkness within. Dust? Dark? Now, why did that make me feel worse, almost nauseated? I snapped a few curious photographs of the place, a sort of denial of my fears, and quickly departed. It wasn't a long walk back to the car, but I intended to make it before dark fell entirely. That night, I had another dream. This one was shorter and murkier, but felt nonetheless like a memory to me. I dreamt I was somewhere dark and dusty and hot. Maddie was there, once again. I was frightened, though I was not certain why. I held something in my hand, which reflected what little light there was to reflect. I don't know what it was. "Go ahead," she told me. "It's okay." "I can't," I told her, on the edge of tears. I don't know why. "Yes, you can," she assured me, gently. "It's easy. It's the easiest thing in the world to do." It was hot in the dusty darkness, and it smelled. It smelled of dust, and of hot, and of sweat, too. It smelled of old canvas bags and haze and decay. I felt nauseous, and I had to pee. Can we go?" I asked, fidgeting. I didn't want to be in the dusty dark anymore. "Sure," she told me brightly. "We can go, and I'll buy you an ice cream. But you have to do this first, or else you can't be in the club with me." I wanted to be in the club with her. I loved Maddie. But what she wanted me to do, it scared me. I don't know what she wanted me to do, though. "Okay," I told her, and swallowed hard. I would do anything for Maddie. I gripped the something I had in my hand, and though I could scarcely see her in the darkness, I could tell she was smiling at me. I loved when Maddie smiled at me. She was holding something, too. I couldn't tell what she was holding, but it jerked around in her hands. It groaned. It was alive. I gasped, awake in the night, sweating. I could still smell the dust and the heat and the decay, and I had to pee. I spent the next morning chugging coffee and reviewing my photos and sketches from the day before. After waking up from that nightmare, my sleep for the rest of the night could be described as fitful at best. Despite this, I could not hold on to a bad mood. From the aforementioned thousands of photos, I found numerous likely subjects for paintings, including one or two I was eager to start upon immediately. I never claimed to be a professional photographer, though I was competent enough for my own purpose. When I worked from reference, I had a tendency to sort of embellish in the name of artistic license, which I felt made up for my shortcomings in the department. Probably due more to the beauty of the day and the perfect timing of my arrival. I had some photos I judged I would hardly have to embellish at all. Easy peasy. According to the clock on the wall and the rumbling in my stomach, it was about lunchtime. Probably wise I should eat before starting a painting, as I was unlikely to stop for the next several hours. In art school, my workload was so heavy I barely had enough time for any other schoolwork, let alone eating and sleeping. For days, I would live off of Tums, coffee, and cigarettes, while working nearly round the clock to make deadlines. I was a bit more relaxed after graduating, which is probably for the best since I quit smoking immediately after getting my diploma. For lunch, I had a ham sandwich and a bowl of soup, but I was too eager to get started to really taste it at all. Hell, I was too eager to eat it at the table. I just scarfed it down over the sink and dumped my bowl in there when I was finished. For dessert, I had Tums to counteract all the coffee and dashed upstairs to my studio space. I used some paper I used in college. Fluid watercolor paper that measured 30 by 40 and was about 90 pounds of weight. As wet as I tend to work, that was a bit light, and I had a tendency to warp, but I didn't mind. I liked the way it lifted and held the color. Also, it was a bit cheaper, which was a definite plus for a poor college student like me. I kept using it mostly out of habit. Clamps helped with the warping. I glanced at the photo reference and decided an underdrawing would not be a bad idea, at least for the barn and the fence. I turned back to the computer and turned on my painting playlist. The Pixies came first, Bone Machine. I nodded and grabbed a pencil while Black Francis began his baffling spoken word intro over a rolling rhythm of Joey Santiago's wailing guitar riffs. The next few hours ran by in a blur. I could scarcely feel the aching in my back and legs as I stood bent over the table, rendering the scene in strokes of red, oranges, blues, browns, and greens. Pools of color defined themselves slowly into shapes, images, light, and darkness. As always, my mind was blank during this process. It was partially a meditative experience. Eventually, I had to stop and let the paper dry before setting down another layer, for fear of that lonesome gremlin of watercolor, muddiness. I washed my brush and set it down, with the others on a folded paper towel. I sipped at my glass of water and laid down flat on the floor. While I rested my back, I stared up at the ceiling and listened to the Silver Sun pickup song about a little lover. So polite. For the first time that day, I thought about Maddie. Long-lost memories and strange dreams. What did it all mean? Why was I only remembering these things now? It was all so confusing and strangely frightening. Why? And what happened in the darkness? What was the thing Maddie held? What was the thing I held? Was any of it even real? I couldn't help but feel that these were in fact real memories. But if so, what happened to Maddie? Why would my mother not talk about her? If I loved her so much, why was I afraid of her too? Nothing made sense. I tried to push her and all these questions out of my mind. I was here to work, not unfold some mystery. It was a waste of my mental energy, and I wanted to finish this painting tonight if I could. I sat up with some protest from my back muscles, mostly ignored, and checked the paper. Still wet, of course. I had only been laying there for a few moments. With nothing better to do, I decided I would sketch out another painting while I waited. With this in mind, I grabbed my laptop and started rifling through the photos again. I guess thoughts of Maddie were still sticking in my metaphorical craw, because the first photo I pulled up was of that last barn. The one of Fears. Of course, I had no business inspecting this photo, considering my haste and lateness of the day resulted in an artistically useless image. It showed the face of the barn, and not much else. With its door open a crack and revealing nothing, the hayloft open above. Though yesterday it was an open door that emitted a strangely sinister aura, it was the hayloft that caught my attention this time. It was nothing but a portal of darkness, betraying nothing, and yet I could not help but feel it was a clue somehow to all of this. Why? Staring ever closer, I thought I could detect a slightly darker shape in the portal that piqued my interest. Although feeling that strange nausea again, I opened the photo editing software. I turned it up until the entire image was washed out. There was a shape. Now, the program couldn't work miracles. I still couldn't tell what the shape was exactly, but I knew what it could have been. Something I dearly did not want it to be. It looked like the top of someone's head. I swore softly to myself as I closed the program, declining its offer to save my changes. It could have been anything, I told myself. Literally anything. It's an old barn. It was probably full of junk, old equipment, just rusting in the darkness. It could have been anything. Suddenly, I felt exposed before the cluster of windows so appealed to me in the light of day. That was stupid, of course. I was on the second floor, and anyway, this wasn't the middle of nowhere. It was in the middle of a middle-class neighborhood. I drew the curtains anyway. Who needs open windows after dark? The paper was dry enough. I turned up the music, raising Modest Mouse's perfect disguise to a dull roar. Why not? This wasn't an apartment, and I wouldn't disturb the neighbors. While I worked on my autumn landscape, I could push strange memories aside, likewise fears both ephemeral and otherwise. It was close to midnight when I stood back from my work and judged it to be finished. I also judged myself to be near starving. I didn't have the stamina I had as a striving college student. Back then, I would have set this painting aside after a gas station hot dog. I would be good to start on another. Today, I would go downstairs, eat something that had a vegetable in it, and retire to my bedroom. I felt good about the painting. Maybe even ready to dissolve my earlier grumbles about the project. Maybe landscape art wasn't fine art as I saw it, but if I could communicate something I felt was beautiful and it would make someone else happy to look at, that would be enough. For now. I washed my paintbrushes, dumped my grimy water down that sink, and snapped a thumbnail photo of the painting to send to Lisa for approval. She would be happy to see the progress so soon. I wasn't thinking about Maddie at all. Well, not much, anyway. I had another dream that night. 2, actually. The first dream was another Maddie dream. In the dream, I was in my bedroom. A bedroom I did not remember until now. I was laying in my bed, my first big boy bed with its superhero bed sheets. Action figures were scattered all over the floor and spilling from my big toy chest. They offered me no comfort. I was crying. Someone knocked on the door and I sniffled, a stifled sob. It was Maddie. She smiled down at me sympathetically from the doorway. She was wearing a sundress with a floral print. Her hair was wild as it always is. She held something behind her back. "Hey, kiddo," she said. "Can I come in?" I sniffled and nodded. She sat down on the bed beside me and gave me a side hug. I felt better, in spite of myself. We sat there and she swabbed the tears from my cheek. with the hem of her dress. "I'm sorry, Johnny," she told me. She was the only one who ever called me that, but usually she just called me kiddo. I liked it when she called me Johnny. "I guess you weren't ready for that big kid stuff. It's okay if you're not ready." "It is." "Sure, kiddo," she smiled down at me. "You have plenty of time for all of that, and I'll be here to teach you, one step at a time, you know?" "Uh-huh," I said. "And don't you worry," she said, leaning in confidently. "You're still in the club. Vice president." "Yeah?" I asked, my tears already nearly forgotten. "Hey, I got you something at the store today. Do you want to see?" "Sure," I said. Maddie gave me the best presents. Not even for Christmas. Usually for no reason. Just to see me smile. From behind her back, she produced a shopping bag and revealed the gift. It was a G.I. Joe fighter jet. I had been dreaming of getting one for weeks, ever since seeing the commercial on Saturday morning cartoons. I squealed with delight and planted a kiss on her cheek. She laughed and handed the prize to me. I immediately set to rip it open, but she stopped me. "Wait a second, Johnny," she said, looking me in the eyes. "There's just one more thing." "What's that?" I asked, ready to agree to anything at that point. "It's about the club," she said, cautiously. I nodded. "Well, it's about the big kid stuff, actually. See, I think your mom and dad would rather you learn about that stuff when you're older. You know?" I guess so," I replied, unsure. I didn't really like the idea of doing something my mom and dad didn't want me to. "It's just that I don't think they understand how smart you are, how big you've gotten. Mom and dad, they just think you're their little baby." "I'm not a baby," I protested. The way a child fresh out of diapers would protest. "I know you're not." She smiled down at me again. "So here's the thing. If we can keep a secret, we can make a big kid out of you in no time. But if your mom and dad found out, even if you tell one of your friends at school, they'll find out and you'll get in trouble. And here's the other thing, kiddo." "What?" I asked. "Well, I would get in trouble too, you know? And maybe they wouldn't want us to play together anymore. I don't want that to happen. Do you?" "No!" I cried, and I meant it. I loved Maddie. I couldn't stand it if she couldn't play with me anymore. She nodded, satisfied, and said, "Well, that's that then. Clubhouse business is just between Clubhouse members, and that means you and me only, okay?" "Oh, okay," I quickly agreed. "Pinky promise?" she asked, presenting her pinky. I linked mine with hers, a sacred vow. "Pinky promise." "Great," she said, smiling big this time. "Now let's play G.I. Joe, huh? I'll be Cobra." That dream faded to obscurity, and the second dream came later. It wasn't a Maddie dream, or at least it didn't seem to be. I was laying in bed in the dark. I could see someone standing at the foot of the bed, but in the darkness, I couldn't tell who it was. I couldn't move, and I was terribly afraid of the person, but they didn't do anything, just stood there. The next thing I knew, it was the morning.